For months, the HOA had turned my life into a battlefield with their endless rules and petty fines. First, it was the height of my grass, then the paint on my shutters, then even the sound of my dog barking. Every little thing became an excuse for them to slap me with notices and demands. But when they realized I wasn't the kind of homeowner who bowed to their bullying, they took it a step further. It started with snide comments at community meetings, then with strangers parked at the end of my driveway, watching my house at odd hours. And finally, one night, they decided to escalate in a way that crossed every line. I will never forget that evening. I was working late at a nearby job site when my phone buzzed, and I saw my wife's name flash across the screen. Her voice, when I answered, was trembling like I had never heard before. She said that a group of bikers had roared into our quiet street, their engines rumbling like thunder as they circled in front of our home, their headlights flashing against our windows. She described the way they revved their bikes louder and louder until the sound rattled the dishes and the cabinets inside the house. My wife stood frozen, clutching the phone as she whispered that they were shouting threats. One yelled that if I didn't pay the HOA fines and stop fighting their rules, we'd regret it. Another shouted that I'd better start listening before things got ugly. These weren't just rowdy bikers out for fun. They were there for one reason: to scare my wife into breaking me down. The HOA had clearly sent them. The realization made my blood run cold. The thought of her standing at the window alone in the house, while those menacing figures laughed outside, infuriated me and terrified me all at once. I could picture the leather jackets, the heavy boots, the sneering faces as they circled like vultures, and I knew she was outnumbered, helpless against men like that. Yet, even in her fear, she stayed on the phone, whispering to me, telling me what they were doing, her voice cracking as she tried to stay calm. I clenched the wheel of my truck so hard my knuckles turned white. Every second on the road felt like an eternity because I was miles away, and the woman I loved most in the world was being terrorized on my own property and my own front door. And all because a group of entitled HOA board members thought intimidation would bend me to their, well, it was the lowest, dirtiest trick they could have pulled. And in that moment I swore to myself that they would regret it, because the HOA didn't know who they were messing with. They thought I was just another homeowner too scared to fight back. But they had no idea about my past, my connections, and the kind of man I became when my family was threatened. By the time those bikers had finished their first lap around my driveway, I was already tearing down the road toward home, and every second the rage inside me burned hotter because the picture of my wife standing there alone while engines roared and voices threatened was something no husband should ever forget. When I pulled into the neighborhood, I could see them even before I turned onto my street, a line of bikes glinting under the streetlights, their riders laughing like hyenas at their own cruelty. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't coming home empty-handed. Years ago, before the HOA nonsense had ever touched my life, I had built a circle of people I could count on, men I'd trained with, men who understood loyalty and had my back without hesitation. One quick call, and those men were already on their way. So when I stepped out of my truck, I wasn't alone. 3 more vehicles pulled up behind me, and out stepped former military buddies, law enforcement officers, and lifelong friends who didn't need an explanation. They could see the terror in my wife's face from the porch, and that was enough. Within seconds, the night flipped from one of intimidation to one of reckoning. I walked calmly toward the bikers, my boots crunching on the gravel as their engines died one by one, until only silence hung in the air. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need the look in my eyes, and the quiet line of men standing behind me did all the talking. One of the bikers who moments ago had been puffing his chest now shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his jacket. Another tried to force a smirk, but it faltered when I stood only inches away and asked if they enjoyed scaring women. Their bravado cracked almost instantly. The leader cleared his throat and muttered that it was nothing personal, just a job they'd been paid to show up and make some noise. But his words betrayed the fear crawling into his voice, because the truth was written all over his face. These so-called tough guys weren't ready for resistance. They expected a frightened wife and a husband too meek to push back. What they got instead was a wall of unflinching resolve. When one of my buddies stepped closer, arms folded and jaw set, the bikers finally dropped the act. They stammered out apologies, saying they didn't want any trouble. One even admitted through clenched teeth that it was the HOA who had reached out offering cash for them to ride by and put on a show the moment the words left his mouth. I knew I had what I needed, not just the satisfaction of seeing them squirm, but the evidence of the HOA's dirty tactics. I leaned in and told them calmly, but firmly, that if they ever came near my wife or my home again, they wouldn't just have to answer to me, they'd have to answer to every man standing behind me. And believe me, I said it wouldn't be words. Next time, their faces went pale, and for the first time that night, they looked less like bikers and more like lost children caught in a storm within minutes. They were begging me to stop, saying they wanted no part of the HOA's feud anymore. They mounted their bikes with shaky hands and rode off into the night, far quieter than they had arrived. My wife rushed in my arms, trembling, but safe, and I promised her she'd never face anything like that alone again. In the days that followed, word of what happened spread through the neighborhood, and the HOA's carefully crafted mask of authority began to crack. Neighbors who had once stayed silent came forward with their own stories of intimidation, and together we confronted the board armed with proof. And a united voice, the bikers, and never came back. The HOA backed down, and for the first time in months, peace returned to my home. But more than that, it gave me a lesson. I would never forget bullies, no matter how loud or powerful they pretend to be, crumble the second you stand tall against them. And when you fight not just for yourself, but for the people you love, the victory is worth every battle.